Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now a couple of days ago we tested the AMD RX 6600 XT in a handful of games at 1080p resolution. In that video a few of you asked me for some 1440p benchmarks, and so that's what we're doing today. We're going to take a look at 20 games tested at 1440p native resolution. No FSR or upscaling involved here, just 20 games at 2560 by 1440. Let's get straight into the benchmarks then. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p with the medium preset and FSR off. When you choose the medium preset along with a few of the other presets, FSR will turn on automatically, so I just turn that off, as well as a few other personal preferences such as chromatic aberration and a few of the other in-game effects. These don't really affect frame rate, however. When it comes to the gameplay, our frame rate on average was 57 FPS with a 1% low of 46 and a 0.1% low of 42. There are certainly a few games that could benefit from upscaling, but to be honest the majority do okay. Let's move on to Alan Wake 2 next. We have 1440p, of course. I must stop saying that because they're all tested at 1440p with the lowest settings. Now if you choose the low preset, some of the options will remain at medium, but I turned everything down manually to low, and you can definitely tell by the graphics that we are running on the lowest settings here. We saw 52 FPS on average with a 1% low of 21 and a 0.1% low of 15, so some issues here, but it's no surprise considering the game at hand. Starfield next, and again we had to opt for the lowest in-game settings here, once again at 2560 by 1440. Any form of upscaling was of course turned off here, no FSR3 or CAS, for an average of 50 frames per second. We saw a 1% low of 36 and a 0.1% figure of 22. Now the rest of the games ran absolutely fine at this resolution, with what I feel are respectable settings, the first of which is Baldur's Gate 3. Here with the medium preset and TAA we saw 77 FPS with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 29. The target I had in mind for the frame rate today was at least 60 FPS, but of course with a card like the 6600 XT it is important to manage your expectations, and I still feel that this is better suited to a 1080p gaming rig. The Witcher 3 next, with the next gen patch applied at the high settings with TAAU for an average of 79 FPS. The 1% low was 65 and the 0.1% low was 50, so overall this was a pretty consistent experience here. Again, when it came to the settings, I turned a few of my personal preferences off, some of the in-game effects. Hairworks was also off because that's a right FPS hog. In Elden Ring, I chose the higher preset. The only things I manually disabled were motion blur and depth of field, which I do in every game because, well, it's just a personal preference really. I'm not a fan of either in any title that I play, to be fair. This had no problem hitting the in-game FPS cap of 60 FPS with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% figure of 43. Fallout 4 up next, Ultra preset here with TAA. Now I was running this uncapped, but the frame rate never really got high enough to see things speed up like it does with really high frame rates. Once you start to see over 120, 130 FPS, the game does feel a lot faster. Here on average we saw 96 frames per second with a 1% low of 63 and a 0.1% low of 22. So a few little issues in and around those more intensive areas such as Cambridge, for example. The only things I turned off with the settings here were once again motion blur from the graphical menu. I just had to try Kingdom Come Deliverance next. I'm really looking forward to the sequel, having played a lot of this one. For the options, I went with the high preset and enabled HD textures. Everything else was left as it was. SMAA 1TX was also enabled. In and around Rattay, one of the most demanding areas of the game, we saw 98 FPS, along with a little bit of stutter here and there, which to be honest is expected. I think there are a few options you can play around with that do alleviate this somewhat. Here we saw a 1% low of 35 and a 0.1% low of 22. So it was far from consistent, but it was more than playable at this resolution. In Marvel Spider-Man Remastered, I went with the high preset, didn't change anything else, but I did turn some of the other in-game effects like motion blur off, for example. TAA was the anti-aliasing solution of choice here. Overall, we saw 85 frames per second with a 1% low of 61 and a 0.1% figure of 50. So pretty smooth and consistent overall. Now, I wasn't expecting to run into many issues with Grand Theft Auto 5, here with the highest settings. I also maxed out the advanced options. We also had FXAA instead of MSAA, as that's a real FPS hog. On average, we saw 113 FPS with a 1% low of 89 and a 0.1% low of 81. Forza Horizon 5 is very well optimised in my opinion and runs quite well on a lot of graphics cards, even at higher resolutions and higher settings. I went with the Ultra preset here and enabled TAA. Nothing else was changed from the in-game graphics menu, aside from, you guessed it, motion blur. Now, on average, we saw 98 FPS in a multi-competitor race with a 1% low of 88 and a 0.1% low of 84, so a very consistent experience. For The Last of Us, at this resolution, we had to go with the low preset. Nothing else was changed. In game, we saw 70 frames per second with a 1% low of 54 and a 0.1% low of 52. There may be a few dips and drops below 60 FPS in and around those busier areas, but for the most part, we retained at least 60, which is nice to see. I had to try Minecraft RTX. I left the settings at default. Now, before I get back into the gameplay, take a guess at the frame rate. I'll give you a clue. It was less than 60, not only that, but it was less than 30. That's right, 13 frames per second, with a 1% low of 11 and a 0.1% low of 11 for some reason, so I guess it's pretty consistent, but just consistently bad. Not worth playing Minecraft RTX on this AMD card. The normal Minecraft probably runs absolutely fine, of course. Not this one, though. For Palworld, I went with the medium preset and also enabled TAA as our form of anti-aliasing. In game, we saw 64 FPS with a 1% low of 27 and a 0.1% low of 14. Apex Legends next. Here I chose the ultra textures, everything else was set to lowest, but the form of anti-aliasing was TSAA. In game we saw 251 frames per second with a 1% low of 182 and a 0.1% low of 26. So a pretty solid gameplay experience here, aside from a few little dips and drops just as the round was starting. For Counter-Strike 2, I usually go with lower settings just for the sake of retaining a competitive frame rate, but as this is a graphics card benchmark at 1440p, I thought I'd push the boat out a little and go with the high preset here. AA was off, however, and on average we saw 227 FPS. The 1% low was 138 and the 0.1% low was 94. A few of you were recommending or suggesting Helldivers 2, so I've added this to the benchmarks as well. At 1440p, however, with the 6600 XT, we do have to stick to the low preset. I did, however, enable AA to eliminate those horrible jagged edges. Here I was surprised to see 81 FPS with a pretty decent 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% frame rate of 22, so I think the game still looks good at these settings, to be fair, and if you want to play it at 1440p with at least 60 frames per second on this graphics card, you can. Red Dead Redemption 2 up next, ultra textures, everything else set to medium, and TAA was also medium. The geometry LOD was set to max and the grass LOD was set to 2 out of 10. Now, oddly enough, Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't play nicely with this card. It feels quite stuttery, as I think is represented by those percentile lows. Not sure if it's the latest AMD driver, because before I thought this was a problem with Windows 11, but I'm still using Windows 10, and it doesn't do this on my equivalent Nvidia cards, so I'm wondering why it's doing this here. It still feels okay to play, if not a little like the frame rate is lower than it is, so that's worth bearing in mind. The average came back at 74 though, which was decent, but it didn't feel that way. Fortnite next, medium preset, 100% resolution scale, however, and TAA. This always seems to run smoother at 1440p for me for some reason. Although the average frame rate might not be as high as it would be at 1080p, the percentile lows tend to be better at this higher res in my experience. No idea why, but on average we saw 127 FPS, a 1% low of 100, and we saw a 0.1% low of 46. So all in all, a pretty decent result, I think. To finalise then, we have Call of Duty Warzone at 1440p with 100% res scale and the balanced preset. I don't think it's worth going for Ultra here. You will still see at least 60 FPS on this card, but this helps keep things nice and consistent, and it honestly doesn't look that much better visually at Ultra, not in my opinion, compared to Balanced. And in an online competitive FPS title, I don't think graphics mean as much as they do in single player games, but maybe that's just me. Anyway, with the Balanced preset, the gameplay was pretty consistent with an average of 94, a 0.1% low of 63 and a 1% low of 72. Don't know why I read them out that way round, but there we are. All in all then, the 6600 XT at 1440p, 20 games tested. Hopefully this is helpful if you are looking for a used card. There are some games that will probably require the help of upscaling, namely FSR, but outside of those select few, it's still holding up pretty well at a resolution that I didn't think it would be much good at in 2024. Let me know what you think, however, and thank you very much for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.